I'd like to call this hearing to order, and once again, I want to thank the members of the panel for being here, and we look forward to your testimony. All of you have had a lot of experience in the issues that we'll be talking about, so after we finish our opening statements, I'll be introducing each one of you individually. Today, we're holding the 29th day of our American Energy Initiative hearing. We'll be focusing on H.R. 6172, which would prohibit EPA's proposed new source performance standard for greenhouse gases from being finalized until it is technologically and economically feasible. I want to thank Mr. McKinley of West Virginia for spearheading this legislation, and I also want to thank the Democratic members who co-sponsored this legislation. I don't think that anyone is not aware of the fact that this administration has a strong bias against coal. We all are familiar with the President's comments in San Francisco when he was running for President that people would be able to build coal plants if he is elected President, but they would be bankrupt. Yesterday, many of you read about Alpha Resources closing down 8 coal mines, 1,200 jobs. Patriot Coal recently announced they were going into bankruptcy. Murray Coal up in Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Illinois has announced they're going to be closing down 3 mines. And I understand the argument on the other side because they say, well, it has nothing to do with us. It has nothing to do with our regulations. This is because natural gas prices are low, which is true. But even if that were not the case, once this regulation becomes final, no one will be able to build a new coal-powered plant in America. And so I lay that at the foot of the President and his administration. It is their responsibility, and they are responsible for where we are today as it relates to coal. It still produces a great portion of the electricity in our country. Now, it's easy to talk about the benefits of lowering carbon dioxide emissions, and I would be the first to admit the Clean Air Act has been very successful. But I would also say that when EPA considers the benefits, and there are benefits from many regulations, that they have a responsibility to consider the cost and the impact on the health care of the thousands of people who lose their jobs as a direct result of the regulations. And of course, they never consider those costs. And so this legislation is very simple. It basically says, no, you're not going to be able to implement this until it is shown that technologically and economically it is feasible to use carbon capture and sequestration. And it appoints 3 different agencies in the government to make that decision. So I was going to yield to Mr. Barton. I see he's not here. Mr. Shimkus, do you have any comments you'd like to make?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the hearing. There was a huge rally in deep southern Illinois over the weekend to protect and save coal mining jobs in the country, and it for the administration to continue to make this assault on our cheapest form of electricity generation. And I think for a lot of us who've been in this fight for a long time, it's the multitude of rules and regulations that are coming down, from Boiler Mac, Mercury Mac, cooling towers, to Casper, you name it, there's another rule and reg. No wonder there's uncertainty in the industry and in the sector, and no wonder they have to make tough decisions. These tough decisions are the loss of jobs, coal mining jobs in rural America. The untold story is also the loss of a tax-paying base to small rural America that helps support our schools, our hospitals, our local communities, our public safety net. That's why we are as impassioned as our friends on the other side, saying we just got to stop this assault. So I appreciate the hearing. It comes at a critical time, and thank you for it.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, we are here yet another time, yet another day, yet another bill being introduced by my Republican colleagues that will attempt to roll back the progress that the American people have made and block and delay EPA rules that's designed to make our air, land, and water cleaner for the American people, including those people who now currently have and will in the future work in coal mines. Today's hearing marks the 29th in the series of hearings that the majority party has dubbed the American Energy Initiative. But from each of those hearings, which represents hundreds of hours of endless debate, endless discussions, and endless delay, we have enacted exactly zero, nada energy policy to move the country forward. All these hearings, and it hasn't produced not one bill that move this country forward. Mr. Chairman, if today's hearing feels a bit like deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra would say, to those that are watching and this subcommittee, it's because we've been here and we've done this countless times already. Today's hearing will focus on H.R. 6172, a bill that prohibits the EPA from finalizing any standards of performance under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act for carbon dioxide emissions from existing or new fossil fuel-fired power plants unless or until carbon capture and storage is found to be technologically and economically feasible. Ironically, Mr. Chairman, this bill comes on the heels of the last markup the subcommittee held, where the majority defeated an amendment I offered that would have exempted future clean coal projects from the arbitrary December 2011 deadline in my Republican colleagues' misguided attempts to disrupt the Department of Energy loan program by prohibiting any funding for future proposals, regardless of the merits or technological advances of those projects. So as the first attempt to ban any new Department of Energy funding for future clean coal projects, the majority party is now bringing forth a bill that will block and delay EPA rules from finalizing the proposed carbon pollution standards for new power plants or any future carbon pollution standards for existing power plants until carbon capture and sequestration is technologically and economically feasible. This bill, to most people, would seem simply like another matter, or simply another attempt to try and shield the dirtiest polluters from common sense air quality standards that would make their facilities cleaner and more efficient while protecting Americans' health. Mr. Chairman, this messaging bill sends a clear message to industry that if we don't succeed once, twice, 10, 20, or in this instance 29 times, we would try and try and try again to show the industry that we're with them, standing shoulder to shoulder with them, not to be divided by the plight or the affairs of Americans' public health. Mr. Chairman, this is a dead-on arrival bill, as you well know. And if the stakes weren't so high and important to protect the American people, then we could get a laugh out of 29 times and nothing to show for it. These message after message attempts on the part of the Republicans. Whatever happened to governing through bipartisan legislation? Mr. Chairman, I think that this bill and our time here is a waste of our energy, a waste of our time, and it certainly is not an attack on coal. It's an attack on progress and what's best for the American people and common sense. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing on H.R. 6172 continues the committee's oversight of EPA's costly regulatory agenda and follows previous subcommittee hearings on EPA's myriad greenhouse gas regulations, including its most recently proposed rule that would establish new emission standards for fossil fuel-fired power plants. We're extremely concerned about the impacts that this proposed rule would have on the future of affordable coal-fired power operation in America if indeed it is finalized. As currently written, the rule requires any new coal-fired plants to install costly carbon capture and sequestration technology. However, even President Obama's Department of Energy has acknowledged that CCS technology is not yet commercially available and that large-scale commercialization remains years, if not decades, away. Leaders in CCS technology and industry stakeholders agree that significant technical, legal, regulatory hurdles still need to be overcome in order to successfully bring CCS to commercial scale. And because CCS technology remains in its early stages of development, not a single CCS developer in the world can currently guarantee that its technology will work at commercial scale. And without such a guarantee, power plant operators will not and cannot make investment in CCS technology. In other words, unless and until CCS technology is proven to be commercially viable and cost-effective, EPA's proposed rule will effectively prevent the construction of any new coal-fired plants in America. But a ban on coal-fired generation is the end result that the administration probably is trying to achieve. We shouldn't be surprised by that. This administration's position on coal has been crystal clear. President Obama himself said he wants to, quote, bankrupt coal companies, and that, quote, electricity prices will necessarily skyrocket. Meanwhile, the Secretary of Energy has declared that coal is his worst nightmare. Those are his words. This proposed rule would do exactly what the administration set out to do from the start, prohibit the future of coal use in this country. Clearly, there's a war on coal that's being waged by the administration. Just ask the 1,200 employees of Alpha Natural Resources that were told this week that they're going to be out very quickly because of the announced mine closures forced in part by federal regs aimed at restricting the use of coal, or the hundreds, probably thousands of other miners across the coal belt who have recently received pink slips too. If finalized, this rule will have a detrimental impact on electricity generation in the country and future electric prices as well. That's why we're going to continue to scrutinize EPA's proposed rule, and why I appreciate the gentleman from West Virginia's leadership on this bill, and I will yield now the balance of my time to Mr. McKinley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just in support of this, the EPA is indeed proposing a regulation that future coal-fired facilities must implement a carbon capture system that reduces their emissions by 50%. But like you've heard from some of the other speakers, it cannot be performed. There are no commercially applications available. We've even heard testimony, as you've heard from before, from the EPA saying we know that it can't be done for 10 years or more. Therefore, the mission here is no coal-fired electric powerhouses will be constructed in America until this technology is available. Now, that has to be coupled with the concept of maybe through research and development. Maybe that'll happen. But we all know here in Congress that this administration has cut the research money in National Energy Technology Lab. Last year, 40%. This year, 41%. How are we going to achieve this objective if we don't have the research into the development of this process? You've heard the quotes. I'll add one more. Joe Biden has said, the vice president has said that this administration does not support clean coal technology. What better manifestation of it in this particular rule that they're promulgating? They're trying to bankrupt and stop us from burning coal, and what they're doing is hurting the working men and women all across America, putting them out of work, these 1,200 people. We've learned that AEP has already canceled one of its own projects at the Mountaineer plant because they found out that cost was going to be, as I understand it, increasing the utility bills by 80% to consumers, to schools, to manufacturers, and they chose not to do it. So for anyone that believes that there's no war on coal, they're in denial. This president's administration and those who support it are hurting our consumers. They're hurting our nation. They're closed-minded about where we're going to go in developing our fossil fuels, the fuel that fueled our industrial revolution. So this war on coal must stop. There's ideologically driven regulations must not be implemented until the technology and the economics justify their cost. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
This time I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This committee has heard a lot of arguments for victims, and people are being convinced that they're victims by the government when that's not the case. Let me cite an example. This committee had a hearing on EPA's proposed regulation of farm dust. Can anybody think of anything more ridiculous than regulating farm dust? It's ubiquitous to farms. So this committee rushed legislation to protect the farmers from EPA regulation of farm dust, even though EPA said they had no plans to regulate farm dust. And we passed a bill. You know what the bill did? It provided for repeal of regulations from open pit mining that put out particulate matter and toxic substances in the air. So that farmers were told they were victims and they were being used for a different purpose. It's not the government's fault if a utility decides it's cheaper to use natural gas than coal. That's called what we call economics. If it's cheaper to use another substance, they'll use it. Do we want to stop them from doing that? Do we want to stop the free enterprise system? We don't have the technology to remove the carbon from coal and store it. It's a technology we all should want to have. But the industry has no incentive to develop that technology because they're doing fine selling coal and using coal without that technology. That would just be an extra expense. So you have two ways you can get that technology. One is to say you've got to use it in order to achieve a certain standard, or that's the best way to achieve that standard. That's the way the environmental laws have worked in the past. As long as we allow any source of electricity to compete, as long as it does not cause unacceptable harm to health and the environment. This bill picks winners and losers. The other, EPA, would set a standard that companies that generate electricity from coal will not have a free pass on pollution. But there was another way to do it. That was the way Mr. Upton proposed in legislation. That would have put a fee on those who get electricity from coal, and that fee would have been used exclusively for research and development of the technology. That was a bill he introduced in the last Congress with Mr. Boucher, and I suggested to him that we would take up that bill and vote for it. We can't do anything else, at least do that. Never heard any other word on the subject after we proposed doing that. The Republicans in this bill, in this House, passed H.R. 910, the Upton-Inhofe bill. That would have barred EPA from reducing dangerous carbon pollution and codified science denial by overturning EPA's scientific finding that carbon pollution endangers health and welfare. It's a premise that climate change is a hoax. And since that time, early last year, this Republican House has proved to be the most anti-environmental in the history of the Congress. Republicans have voted more than 300 times on the House floor to weaken long-standing public health and environmental laws, block environmental standards, defund protections of our air, water, and public lands, oppose clean energy. They voted 47 times to block action on climate change. When they passed that Upton-Inhofe bill a year and a half ago, House Republicans argued science was uncertain, EPA was exceeding its authority. By now, everybody should understand that they were wrong on both counts. The science has been clear, and just look at all the signs of climate change occurring around us. Recent wildfires, droughts, heat waves, exactly the types of extreme weather events that scientists have been predicting for years and that this committee has been ignoring. Since that passage of the Upton-Inhofe bill, we have sent 17 letters to the chairman of this committee requesting hearings on new developments in climate science. We haven't even gotten a reply. Instead, what we have is the leadership of this committee talking about a war on coal. And if coal miners are losing their jobs, it's because of the government. Well, it's because of economics and the unwillingness of the Republicans who control the House to figure a way out of this issue. The EPA is not overreaching. The courts have affirmed their power to regulate in this area. It's about time we try to help the people in the coal area be viable in a new economy that's coming. Otherwise, you can scare them with war, talk of war against them, but it's a dishonest approach. It doesn't help them. It stirs up the feelings of victimology by the people in these areas, and I suppose it's supposed to help Republicans in the election. But sometimes let's stop paying politics and deal with national urgent matters, and this committee has refused to do it for a year and a half.
This time I'd like to introduce the members of the panel. Once again, thank you for being with us today. We look forward to your testimony. First, we have Mr. Eugene Trisco, who's an attorney at law representing the United Mine Workers of America. We have Mr. Mark McCullough, who's Executive Vice President, Generation, American Electric Power. We have Mr. John Voiles, Jr., who is the Vice President, Transmission and Generation Services at Louisville Gas and Electric and KU Energy. We have Mr. Robert Hilton, who's Vice President, Power Technologies for Government Affairs at Alstom Power. And we have Mr. John Thompson, who is the Director, Fossil Transition Project at the Clean Air Task Force. And we have Dr. Dan Lashoff, who's the Director of Climate and Clean Air for the Natural Resources Defense Council. And we have Dr. John R. Christie, who's Professor and Director of the Earth Science and Systems Center at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. So thank you for being with us. Each one of you will be given 5 minutes to...
I've had the honor of representing the UMWA in Clean Air Act and domestic international climate change issues for the past 25 years. H.R. 6172 is sound policy and a common-sense solution to the threat to new advanced coal generation posed by EPA's proposed carbon pollution standard rule. That rule sets a uniform CO2 emission rate of 1,000 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour, applicable to both coal and natural gas combined cycle units. New coal units would need to employ CCS technology to comply, while new natural gas combined cycle units could comply without CCS. EPA and DOE's National Energy Technology Lab estimate that applying CCS to new coal-based units would increase the cost of electric power by 80%. CCS has not been commercially demonstrated in this country, as indicated by the findings of the 2010 Interagency Task Force report on carbon capture and storage. EPA's proposed rule is simply a means of forcing winners and losers in the future market for electric generation. The proposed rule also ignores 40 years of EPA regulation under the Clean Air Act by lumping together these two very different sources of electric generation into one category, subject to a single emission standard that only one type of source can meet. The EPA rule says, in effect, that the best system of emission reduction for new coal and natural gas units is natural gas combined cycle technology. The mine workers' comments to EPA, which are attached to my testimony, note that natural gas combined cycle is a form of producing electricity, not a best system of emission reduction under the Clean Air Act. The UMWA has supported previous legislation to accelerate the commercial demonstration of CCS technologies, including the Upton-Boucher bill. This legislation has not been enacted, and funding available through DOE has not been adequate to support successful large-scale demonstration of CCS technology. We are hopeful that new proposals will be developed to put CCS demonstration projects on a firmer financial footing. Coal is an indispensable part of America's energy supply and must be a core element of any all-of-the-above energy policy. More than one-third of our nation's electricity is generated by coal, mainly in baseload plants. The principal alternatives to coal for future baseload generation are nuclear and natural gas. While natural gas prices have declined recently, substantial uncertainties surround future natural gas prices, particularly in view of the 40 to 60-year lifetimes of electric generation assets. The U.S. should take the lead in establishing the technical and commercial viability of CCS technology for use both here and abroad. India and China have vast coal reserves and will continue to rely upon them to support their own economic development. China alone consumes 3 times more coal than we do. Our recoverable coal reserves hold the energy equivalent of the world's proven oil reserves. The U.S. should pursue policies that will accelerate, not stymie, the full range of advanced coal technologies, including commercial-scale demonstration and deployment of CCS. Rethinking the EPA carbon pollution standard rule is an important step in that direction, and we support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And Mr. McCullough, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Minority Member Rush, and distinguished members of the Committee on Energy and Commerce, thank you for inviting me here today. I appreciate this opportunity to offer the views of AEP on EPA's proposed greenhouse gas new source performance standard and the current state of carbon capture and storage technology. My name is Mark McCullough. I'm the Executive Vice President of Generation at AEP. AEP is one of the nation's largest generators, owning more than 37,000 megawatts of generating capacity and serving more than 5 million retail customers. AEP's generating fleet employs diverse fuel sources, including coal, nuclear, hydroelectric, natural gas, oil, and wind. Due to the location of our service area and historic importance of coal to the economies of our states, approximately 2/3 of our generating capacity utilizes coal. AEP has a long history of proactive involvement in environmental stewardship, particularly with regard to reducing its net carbon emissions. Perhaps AEP's most significant contribution to technology solutions for addressing greenhouse gas emissions was a successful completion of a validation scale demonstration of the world's first fully integrated CCS project at an existing coal-fired electric generating unit. The Mountaineer CCS project treated a 20 megawatt portion of flue gas from our 1,300 megawatt Mountaineer plant, removed the CO2, compressed it, and injected it into 2 deep underground formations from 2009 to 2011, permanently storing nearly 40,000 tons of CO2. AEP has long maintained that the Clean Air Act is not a practical or cost-effective vehicle to limit greenhouse gas emissions, and any system to regulate greenhouse gas emissions should be developed by Congress. Global climate change and greenhouse gas emissions present a new set of issues that the existing framework of the Clean Air Act was never intended to address. As such, regulation of greenhouse gases under the existing Clean Air Act. As such, regulation of greenhouse gases under the existing Act is likely to be ill-designed and significantly more costly than a more flexible legislative approach. The proposed new source performance standard is a fuel discriminatory rule that in effect requires CCS technologies that are not yet commercially available to be used on all new coal plants. As such, the NSPS is impractical and not legally justifiable. AEP's main concerns are the combination of two source categories, coal and natural gas, and setting a single standard based on EPA's estimate of the emission rate achievable at a new natural gas combined cycle unit. This standard will preclude the construction of new coal-fired generation without the addition of CCS. However, based on AEP's experience and EPA's own admission, this technology is neither commercially demonstrated nor economically viable for coal-fired electric generation. Without a viable CCS solution, the NSPS forces reliance on a historically volatile commodity, natural gas, for new fossil generation, which could burden consumers with additional and unnecessary future risk in their energy costs. AEP believes that technological solutions such as CCS are critical to reducing emissions. However, CCS technology has not yet been proved at a commercial scale and cannot be provided with robust guarantees on performance and reliability. Furthermore, the path to CCS commercialization is also filled with significant regulatory and legal barriers regarding the ownership of storage space and long-term liability, which will also need to be resolved prior to commercialization. Given the obvious need for commercially available and cost-effective CCS in order to meet EPA's proposed NSPS for coal plants, H.R. 6172, introduced by Representative McKinley, provides much needed congressional direction in finalizing the NSPS for power plants and ensures that coal continues as a fuel for a balanced energy future. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Voiles, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Minority Member Rush, and distinguished subcommittee members. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to present comments regarding proposed House Bill 6172. My name is John Voiles, Jr. I'm Vice President of Transmission and Generation Services for LG&E and KU Energy. LG&E and KU Energy is a wholly owned subsidiary of PPL Corporation and operate Louisville Gas and Electric Company and Kentucky Utilities Company, regulated utilities that serve 1.3 million customers in 90 Kentucky counties and 5 counties in Virginia. Today, the companies operate a capacity of approximately 8,100 megawatts. Of that capacity, 74% is coal-fired, 25% is gas-fired peaking units, and the remaining 1% is hydroelectric. Approximately 96% of our coal-fired capacity is equipped with controls for sulfur dioxide, and 67% of the capacity has SCR for nitrogen dioxide control. After assessing the impact of the most recent regulations promulgated by the EPA, the companies developed compliance plans which were presented to and approved by the Kentucky Public Service Commission in December of 2011 and May of 2012. Those plans included installing additional environmental controls at 4 stations, retiring 800 megawatts of coal-fired capacity, and constructing a new 640-megawatt gas-fired combined cycle units. These investments are expected to cost up to an additional $3 billion and projected to raise electric rates by up to 14% and 18% for KU and LG&E customers, respectively, by 2016. My company has not been standing idly by on the sidelines waiting for carbon dioxide policy or regulatory developments. Since 2006, we've invested millions of dollars in research and development aimed at finding technically and economically viable carbon management solutions for electric generating units. We were the founding member of the Carbon Management Research Group at the University of Kentucky's Center for Applied Energy Research and a member of the Western Kentucky Carbon Storage Foundation. The CMRG membership has grown to include 3 other electric generators that operate in Kentucky and the Electric Power Research Institute. We have made our E.W. Brown coal-fired plant site available to the CMRG as the test location for a carbon capture slipstream project, which received a $14.5 million supporting grant from the Department of Energy in 2011. Additionally, we fund research on carbon capture technology supported by 2 other DOE grants, one with the University of Texas and one with the 3H Company. As a member of EPRI, we continue to fund collaborative research for carbon management and stay abreast of technological developments. Through these efforts, we track several pilot projects in North America and across the globe. We are aware of no full-scale application of carbon capture and storage in continuous operation on a fossil-fueled electric generating unit. There are several technical and policy hurdles for CCS that remain unresolved, which I will highlight briefly today. First, the energy penalty to add CCS technology to a coal-fired electric generating unit is prohibitively high. Many of the current pilot projects estimate that the parasitic load and cycle efficiency penalties to be at least 25 or 30% of a generation station output. For a company like mine, those penalties would mean if CCS technology were retrofitted to an existing 2,000 megawatt coal-fired station producing power for our customers today, the output from that plant would be reduced by 500 megawatts at a minimum. That loss of production capability would have to be replaced by some source of energy supply, creating additional costs for the consumers and perhaps other emissions to the environment. However, an even bigger challenge is the application of CO2 storage technology. While some carbon dioxide is successfully being utilized in enhanced oil or methane recovery operations, and other pilots have successfully injected small quantities of CO2 into deep saline aquifers, the volume of storage necessary to facilitate such operations on a continuous basis for the life of an electric generating station has yet to be established. Very serious questions remain regarding the implications such injection processes have on mineral and property rights, the monitoring of the CO2 plume across property lines or state boundaries, and the verification systems necessary to ensure long-term monitoring is taken into account. We believe these questions loom much larger than the simple view that CO2 can be captured and injected underground and might be done more cost-effectively with less energy penalties at some undetermined point in the future. Until such time as CCS technology is commercially available to be deployed at full scale in a technical and economical manner, we are concerned that any standard of performance proposed for CO2 emissions from existing or new electric generating units will effectively eliminate coal-fired generation from the nation's energy portfolio. On July 16, 2012, we provided testimony to the subcommittee on the U.S. EPA's proposed greenhouse gas new source performance standards. In those comments, we explained the importance of having separate standards for new and existing plants by fuel type, and are concerned that the EPA's proposal for new plants could not even be met by new gas-fired plants. Those comments assumed that EPA is required by law to develop greenhouse gas standards. A clearly better course would be for Congress to pass legislation relieving EPA of the obligation to develop greenhouse gas standards until carbon capture and storage becomes an economically and technologically viable option. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on House Bill 6172.
Thank you very much, Mr. Foyles. And Mr. Hilton, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Robert Hilton. I hold the position of Vice President of Power Technologies for Government Affairs for Alstom. I'd like to thank Chairman Whitfield and Ranking Member Rush, as well as the entire subcommittee, for the opportunity to address these key issues on CCS. Alstom is a global leader in power generation, transmission, and transportation infrastructure. More than 50% of the power plants in the United States have Alstom equipment, and 25% of the world's electricity is generated on Alstom equipment. We are the largest air pollution control company in the world. In the U.S., Alstom employs about 6,000 full-time permanent employees in 45 states and 91,000 globally. Alstom provides virtually all power generation technology options. Significant pillars of our program are deployment of non-CO2 generation like renewables and nuclear, reduced CO2 emissions through efficiency, and the CO2 capture from fossil fuels, CCS. Alstom invests about $1 billion annually in R&D. Alstom has completed work on 4 pilot and validation scale plants and has 10 pilots, validation, and commercial scale plants in operation, design, or construction worldwide. These CCS projects include both coal and gas generation. We're here today to specifically address the status of CCS as a commercial technology. CCS is, within the realm of innovation, no different than any other technology under development. It is required to move through various stages of development at consistently larger scale. Alstom has taken each of its CCS-related technologies from bench level to validation scale with the aim of finally reaching commercial. However, to date, no CCS technologies have been deployed at commercial scale. Validation scale is the proof of technology in real field conditions. This is important, and it is at this point we can say confidently that the basic technology works. CCS technology is technologically feasible now. The final stage to reach commercial is to perform a demonstration at full scale. It is critical to define the risk of technology to make offers. This cannot be defined until the technology can be shown to work at full scale. This is the first opportunity we have to work with the exact equipment and exact operating conditions that will become the subject of contractual conditions, including performance and contractual guarantees. This also becomes the first opportunity to optimize the process and equipment to best affect performance and seek cost reduction. Based on these criteria, Alstom does not currently deem its technologies for CCS commercial, and to my knowledge, there are no other technology suppliers globally that can do so. I emphasize, however, that the technologies being developed by Alstom work successfully. For a number of reasons, primarily related to technology, funding, and lack of regulatory clarity, the timeline for commercialization of CCS is not clear. The current DOE program for first-generation technologies on CCS appears not likely to become operational until 2017, with the exception of the Kemper plant. Globally, the picture is similar. When we look at the history of EPA and the air pollution control industry, we generally see a harmony of regulation and technology development. In many cases, we have had the opportunity to meet or anticipate the needs of certain technologies. In other cases, we have developed these in other industries. In the recent rulemaking, EPA has required CCS for all new coal plants and conceivably gas plants, while Alstom, in conjunction with EPA, with AEP, has run the largest plant. We are not ready to do this on 500 or 1,000 megawatt plants. It's been suggested that the proposed rule would stimulate CCS development. However, advancing CCS requires a regulatory approach that recognizes the steps of the technology development and process and the need for financing. Commercial power plants cannot secure financing for a plant that includes technology still under development and that carries with it undefined guarantees. Coal is an important part of America's future energy mix, as it has been in the past. It is an abundant resource we have, and we have the technologies to make it clean in all other respects. CCS is coming, but preventing new highly efficient coal plants from being built to replace older, less efficient plants by requiring technology not yet in practice is not in keeping with the needs of the industry or the public. We believe a more realistic approach would provide a reasonable ramp down of CO2 over time that can take advantage of efficiency and other technologies to reduce CO2 in a gradual manner. This would provide the industry, along with state and local regulators, with the needed incentive to support CCS. Alstom believes that the technology will be commercial when the industry determines that both buyer and seller can enter into ordinary contractual relations that meet the needs of both parties. We know that carbon capture technology works. We believe CCS will play a pivotal role in meeting the needs of carbon. We need time and support to reach the point of commercial offerings. I thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Hilton. And Mr. Thompson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rush, members of the committee. My name is John Thompson. I direct the Fossil Transition Project of the Clean Air Task Force. The Clean Air Task Force is a nonprofit environmental group headquartered in Boston and with offices in Beijing, Illinois, Ohio, Washington, D.C., Texas, New Hampshire, and Maine. I'm from our Carbondale, Illinois office. Our mission is to reduce the air pollutants associated with climate change and premature death and disease. We work throughout the United States and China on these issues. And the project I direct works to shift fossil fuels to use technologies that have less impact on the environment. I want to be clear. Worldwide coal use will increase dramatically in the coming decades as the standard of living in developing nations improves. Increasing energy efficiency, greater use of renewables and nuclear power will displace some of the CO2 emissions associated with this growth in fossil use. But any meaningful climate action must include widespread use of carbon capture and storage. It's the only technology that can remove up to 90% the carbon dioxide from large stationary sources. Without CCS, it will be difficult, if not impossible, to avoid the worst aspects of climate change. The Clean Air Task Force is committed to finding ways to advance CCS development. Our organization has filed some comments in support of air permits for coal plants with CCS. We've advocated for coal projects that use advanced technology before state public service commissions. We've worked to promote incentives for CCS and EOR, and we've supported regulations that establish CO2 emission limits that enable CCS. We've promoted partnerships between U.S. and Chinese companies to encourage that would lower CCS costs and encourage projects in both countries. I also serve on the National Coal Council, which advises DOE on coal-related projects. I'd like to make a few points this morning. First, the value of CCS. goes beyond reducing emissions for the purpose of climate change. Capture of CO2 from industrial and power sources could be used to expand domestic oil production through EOR. Currently, EOR accounts for 6% of domestic oil production. But with additional supplies of carbon dioxide, more oil could be produced from domestic oil wells. Estimates for the amount of EOR that can be produced domestically have grown in recent years. DOE has estimated that approximately 67 billion barrels of oil are economically recoverable. But to produce that 67 billion barrels of oils, we need approximately 20 billion tons of CO2. That's an amount that's equivalent to about 30 years of CO2 emissions from about a third the nation's coal plants. Now, contrary to assertions earlier today, several coal plants are proposed or under construction that show the feasibility of CCS at scale and would meet EPA's CO2 emission standards for fossil plants. And they would use the CO2 for EOR to increase domestic oil production. These include Mississippi Power's plant Ratcliffe in Kemper County and Summit Power's Texas Clean Energy plant in Odessa, Texas. Plant Ratcliffe is a 582 megawatt IGCC plant which began construction in 2010 and is expected to go into operation in 2014. It'll gasify lignite, it'll capture 65% of the CO2 emissions and sell them for EOR. The Texas Clean Energy plant is a 400 megawatt gross plant that would capture 90% of its CO2 and produce about 200 megawatts of power and fertilizer and produce about 2.5 million tons of CO2 to produce 7 million barrels of oil annually. But I'd like to make the points, a couple things here. First of all, its CO2 performance standards are needed to gain Public Service Commission approval for coal CCS projects. After AEP's West Virginia Mountaineer project was denied, Mike Morris, the CEO of AEP, made a statement and included this sentence. It's impossible to gain regulatory approval to recover our share of costs for validating and deploying the technology without federal requirements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions already in place. U.S. EPA considered technical feasibility and cost in its draft CCS rule. They concluded CCS was technically feasible and addressed the cost issues through a number of means, establishing reasonable standards, a 50% reduction overall through partial capture, rather than full capture of 90%. They provided regulatory flexibility. They gave longer periods of time to comply with the standards, and I think this approach is reasonable. I'd like to just conclude by saying that the problem with H.R. 6172 is that you can't consider technical and economic feasibility in a vacuum. You must consider it in the context of regulations, and EPA's regulatory approach is reasonable. And what's more, contrary to the intent of the sponsors of this bill, I believe this will add confusion to regulations, which will only help the building of natural gas plants. We need certainty. What H.R. 6172, by creating this regulatory confusion, would do would contribute to the following problems. It would delay new CCS projects because regulators would not know whether they had to meet these standards in order to build them. It would delay the economic production of oil through EOR, and it would replace long-standing precedent of promoting technology that has achieved significant public health and environmental benefits with a static, backward-looking approach. So I would conclude by just saying this. What Congress really needs to focus on is two things. We need performance standards, but we also need incentives to move EOR. EPA's regulations, coupled with further incentives, I believe is the correct approach. H.R. 6172 would delay that progress. Thank you.
Dr. Lashoff, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Rush, members of the committee. My name is Daniel Lashoff. I'm the director of the Climate and Clean Air Program at NRDC, and appreciate the opportunity to testify before the committee. NRDC strongly opposes H.R. 6172 for a simple reason. It would interfere with EPA doing its job, which the taxpayers pay it to do and want it to do, of protecting public health from dangerous carbon pollution. And let's not make any mistake. Carbon pollution is dangerous. It's imposing staggering health and environmental costs in the United States and around the world now, contributing to more severe heat waves, worsening smog pollution, fueling more extreme weather that takes the lives of thousands of Americans and causes billions of dollars in damage. So EPA is moving forward under the law and following the science in proposing the standards that it has proposed to set performance standards for carbon dioxide emissions from power plants. Let me just give you one. Mr. Rush commented that this seems like deja vu. Let me give you one piece of new information. This was released yesterday, and it updates my testimony, even though it was only submitted a couple days before. NASA released new data showing the minimum Arctic ice that we've ever seen since satellites have been monitoring this in 1979. The minimum was reached on September 16th. It's a full 50% below the minimum from 1979 when the record started, about 50% below the average from the 80s and 90s. And we're confident that this is driven by carbon pollution, which is trapping heat in the atmosphere, because not only are we setting this record minimum ice extent, but the thickness of the remaining ice is much lower, making it more vulnerable. And the warming that we see is not just in the ice. The heat is accumulating in the oceans, which is a major driver of this. Now, this is the Arctic. It's far away. Most Americans don't visit the Arctic. None of us own land up there, except a few folks in Alaska. So why do we care about this? The fact is that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. The changes here are so dramatic, and they affect the energy balance of the entire Earth. They change the position of the jet stream. They accelerate the melting of the Greenland ice, which does contribute to more rapid sea level rise, and they contribute to enhancing global warming in several other ways that I detail in my testimony. So this startling image, I think, should give us all pause and recognize that we need to allow EPA to move forward and do its job. Now, I comment specifically on the proposed regulation that EPA has issued because we've heard language about a war on coal, about how the EPA is picking winners and losers. The fact is that EPA's proposed standards for carbon emissions are fuel and technology neutral. They set a rate for all plants that provide the same service of providing base load and intermediate load electricity to consumers. This is the kind of common sense, performance-based standard that I would expect Congress to welcome. It's not a command and control regulation. It doesn't say what technology to use. It's completely technology and fuel neutral. H.R. 6172 turns that on its head by limiting EPA's ability to move forward with that regulation until one particular technology is deemed technically and economically feasible. Now, as both Mr. Thompson and Mr. Hilton have testified, CCS is technically feasible. It's not economically feasible for the simple reason that no commercial entity is building new coal-fired power plants with or without CCS now. The economics, in the absence of performance standards for carbon dioxide, dictate that we're meeting our electricity needs through energy efficiency, through expansion of renewable energy such as wind, and through natural gas, which is much less expensive. So Congress can no more repeal those rules of economics than they can repeal the physics and chemistry that's driving climate change. The reality is that we hold no other EPA standards up to this single technology approach. EPA has moved forward for decades with performance-based standard, and they should be allowed to do their job as the American people would like them to do, to set sensible performance standards for carbon emissions from power plants. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Christie, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield and Ranking Member Bush and Rush and committee members.
Is your microphone turned on?
The light's on. Pull it in. Okay. Thank you, Chairman Whitfield and Ranking Member Rush and members of the committee. I'm John Christie, Alabama State climatologist, professor of atmospheric science, and director of the Earth System Science Center at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I'm a climate scientist who builds data sets from scratch to answer questions about climate variability and to test assertions people make about climate change. That's really what the scientific method's all about. During the heat wave of late June and early July, high temperature extremes became newsworthy. Claims were made that thousands of records were being broken and that this is what global warming looks like. However, these headlines were not based on climate science. As shown in Figure 1.3 of my testimony, it is scientifically more accurate to say this is what Mother Nature looks like, since heat waves even worse than these happened before greenhouse gases were increasing like they are today. Now, it gives some people great comfort to offer a quick and easy answer when the weather strays from the average, rather than struggle with the real truth, which is we don't know enough about the climate to even predict these kinds of heat waves, as Nature magazine itself reported yesterday. More evidence is available now to suggest that the climate is not as sensitive to extra greenhouse gases as previously thought. A simple comparison between climate model output and observations makes this point. In Figure 2.1 of my written text, I plotted 38 of the very latest climate model simulations. The models tend to overreact to carbon dioxide by warming the Earth much more than what has actually happened. This has bearing on the recent 33-year record low of Arctic sea ice coverage that you saw previously. Model projections warmed by CO2 show somewhat more warming than in that region than the observations, but not too much in Figure 2.2. It is tempting to believe that the models are correct and the CO2 warming is the main cause of melting the ice. However, when compared with the area of sea ice around Antarctica, where, as shown in Figure 2.3, the temperature is not increasing and the sea ice is not decreasing, in fact it's increasing, the models fail the test. The CO2 warming in climate models doesn't explain what we see. I cite research in my testimony which again points to natural variability as the main cause. I encourage you to propose legislation based upon what observations show rather than speculative trends of climate models. Basing legislation on observations means addressing the large year-to-year variations like droughts and floods, which will always occur and which will continue to cause economic distress. When it comes to legislation or regulatory actions, there really is nothing that will definitively alter whatever the climate's going to do. However, I suspect there will be some discernible negative economic consequences if energy costs are made to rise. As more CO2 is released back into the atmosphere, there are benefits that are often overlooked. Most notable of these is the invigoration of plant life on which we and the rest of the animal world depend for food. Atmospheric CO2 fundamentally is plant food and therefore our food. In my opinion, higher food production is a benefit to society and should be factored in any cost-benefit analysis. Now, with all due respect to former President Bush, in my opinion, he was not accurate to say in 2006 that we are addicted to oil. Oil and other carbon-based energies are simply the affordable means by which we satisfy our true addictions. And those are long life, good health, plentiful food, internet services, freedom of mobility, comfortable homes with heating, cooling, lighting, and even colossal entertainment systems. Carbon energy has made all those possible. Today, carbon energy provides about 87% of the world's energy demand. So, rising CO2 emissions can be an indicator that a nation is providing energy for its people, energy which allows them to live longer, healthier, and more prosperous lives. But, and I'll close with this unpleasant thought, demanding a reduction in worldwide carbon emissions without affordable and reliable energy alternatives means reducing the opportunities for many of our fellow world citizens to escape their impoverished condition. Thank you for your time. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Christie, and thank all of you for your opening statements. At this time, we'll recognize each member for 5 minutes of questions, and I'll begin by recognizing myself. Mr. Triscoe, Dr. Lashoff, in his opening statement, made the comment that the standard under the proposed greenhouse gas regulation is a common sense, performance-based, fuel-neutral standard. Now, it's my understanding that that proposed regulation reverses 40 years of precedent at EPA in that they're requiring coal to meet the same standards as any other fuel, and in the past they had standards for individual fuels, gas, coal, whatever. Is that your understanding?
In general, yes, Mr. Chairman, and let me explain the basis for this. We're talking really about setting particular standards for different types of generation technologies. EPA has regulated coal for the past 40 years under Subpart DA regulations covering steam electric generating units. These are basically large boilers utilizing coal or oil. There are not many oil boilers now being built. The first coal-based NSPS standard was set by EPA in 1971 pursuant to Section 111 of the 1970 Clean Air Act amendments. That coal-based standard was subsequently revised by EPA in 1978 pursuant to the 1977 Clean Air Act amendments that added the so-called percent reduction clause.
Yeah. If you would excuse me, I asked the question, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but we all get caught up in this time clock. But the bottom line was that in this greenhouse gas regulation, the same emission standard was set for every fuel, and that had never been done before.
What had never been done before, Mr. Chairman, was to combine Subpart DA for steam electric generating units, coal or oil, with Subpart KKKK, which covers natural gas combined cycle units. Those had always been subject to separate, discrete standards.
But not under this regulation.
But not under this regulation.
And that's a significant change. And because of that, we cannot build a new coal-powered plant in the U.S. because the technology is simply not there at an affordable price. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, because, in effect, this regulation raises the cost of electric generation from coal plants by 80%, but does not impose any increase in costs on natural gas combined cycle.
Correct.
Therefore, only natural gas combined cycle plants would be constructed in the future.
So from my opinion, this is not a fuel-neutral proposed regulation. Now, we recognize that it only applies to new coal-powered plants, but what creates additional problems is that the Utility Act applies to existing coal-fired plants. And in order to meet those standards, they're going to have to modify some of the existing plants. And there is some genuine concern that if you modify, then you might be classified as new. Is that your understanding, Mr. Foyles?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. That's my interpretation of how we read the rules. That you make modifications, it does subject you to different parts of the standard.
Yeah, so, you know, when they were up here testifying, Lisa Jackson and others, they were talking about, oh, this applies only to new plants, but it already pushed through the Utility Act, as I said, that applies, makes you modify existing plants, and once you modify, then you've got to meet the new standard. So I think the President's comment when he was running for President clearly shows that there is a bias against coal, and they're following through with that. Now, Mr. Triska, you're here on behalf of Unite Mine workers, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you read yesterday that Alpha Resources is closing down 8 mines. I'm assuming your membership is quite concerned about the way things are happening to the coal industry.
These are not happy times in coal fields generally, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. And you know, in my opening statement, I made the comment that even Lisa Jackson, when she was here, and she said, well, if other countries don't do the same thing on greenhouse gas, then our doing it's not going to make any difference. But the thing that really upsets me is that all these analysis talks about the benefits from on health improving because of regulations, but they never explore, look at, consider in any way the negative impact on the health care of the thousands of people in this industry that are losing their jobs. And they've indicated, no, we don't consider that, which I do not think is a fair and balanced playing field. My time's expired. I recognize for 5 minutes Mr. Rush.
Yeah, I want to, Dr. Lashoff, Mr. Tresco indicated some, he spoke disparagingly of the standards and that the EPA is setting, and he also indicated that these a plant that had was made any modifications, and that plant would be classified as a new plant and would suffer some negative responses, would have to meet higher standards because of the new reclassification. How do you respond to some of the things he said?
Thank you, Mr. Rush. Well, you know, it's funny because EPA is actually very explicit in its proposal in saying that it does not apply to modified plants. They have not proposed any standards that apply to the existing fleet, and the argument that the existing plants couldn't meet the current standard is irrelevant because the proposal only applies to new plants. So, you know, what the problem here with this legislation is it doesn't actually do anything to promote CCS. It just blocks other solutions and cost-effective ways of reducing pollution that's damaging.
I guess that is really my point. I'm from Illinois. Illinois is a coal-producing state. The president is from Illinois, and I don't think that the president is waging an attack on coal. I think the president has taken some postures under his administration to make sure that coal is usable in the future, and that it not only is energy, we can use coal for our energy needs, but also that coal does not have to be harmful to the climate and to our health care. Can you talk about, Mr. Thompson, let me ask you this, can you talk about some of the advances that in clean coal technology that's occurred under the president's administration?
Well, I think perhaps the largest advance has just been the plants that have broken ground. I've mentioned two, the Kemper plant, which broke ground in 2010, and the Texas Clean Energy Project, which will break ground in 2013 and go into operation in 2017. There's been a lot of funding for future gen and projects like that, loan guarantees that help advance coal. But obviously there's more work that needs to be done. And I think Congress should pick up areas that I alluded to, like incentives to promote enhanced oil recovery. There's a lot of work that can be done on both sides of the aisle.
Mr. Hilton, what are the most important things we should do to stimulate CCS development and deployment?
I think there's really, I'd say, four things. You know, we do need a proper regulatory structure that provides guidance to states for permitting and you know, for funding of R&D, and we need financial support. You know, that grants don't go far enough. We need some. Kemper goes ahead because it's got a 20% rate increase associated with it. All the rest of the projects are struggling. But then we have the issues that sequestration is not going to happen until we resolve the issue of financial liability and poor ownership. You know, because you can't.
Sure.
So I think those are the four.
So those are the things that you think that this committee could be focused on that will really be of help to the industry at large. Is that correct? Mr. Lashoff, how important is CCS technology to ensuring a long-term future for coal?
Well, NRDC has supported development of CCS technology. We supported the Upton voucher bill as part of comprehensive legislation that was passed in the last Congress. And as Mr. Thompson said, there are applications around the world. So I think that there's a real need for the U.S. to be a leader in this technology and a big market for CCS. The reality, though, is that the bill that this hearing is about would set up a catch-22 test because it would block the very standards that would actually create an incentive for the industry to invest in making that technology commercial.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Dr. Christie, you've got a very illustrious resume, both academically and professionally. Are you now or have you ever been a part of the IPPC process?
The IPCC, yes, in about every year, including being lead author in one of the assessments.
So you would be acknowledged by the UN officials that operate that as a climate scientist?
I have my certificate that says I'm a Nobel Peace Prize winner.
All right. But you obviously do not appear to share some of the more generic, popularized conclusions that they've promoted. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, that's a fair statement, yes.
Okay. How do you get along with Dr. Mann?
I don't communicate with him since that time back in, we were lead authors together back in 2001.
Okay. Is it fair to state, I mean, the popular presentation is that there are thousands of climate scientists and they all agree that the world's going to hell because of CO2 and that the sooner we start restricting CO2 the better. Obviously you don't share that opinion. How many climate scientists are there like you, and are you ever heard or welcomed in those discussions?
Oh, rarely am I welcomed or heard in those kinds of discussions. But I would say that, it depends on how you define a climate scientist, but it's nothing.
Well, however you define it, you obviously are one.
Yeah, I'm one that, yes, I actually build climate data sets from scratch. I qualify as a working stiff climate scientist. There aren't very many of us, by the way. Other people that like to use the term, have some oblique relationship to how climate might impact something. But in terms of the hardcore, there aren't many of us. And I would say that they are a lot less confident about what climate models can do and can tell us. And the Nature article just appeared yesterday was very clear about the lack of ability of climate models to tell us what is going on with the world and what will go on with it.
Is it fair to state, in your opinion, and the scientists that share your opinion, that the science on CO2 made by man being a primary contributor is unsettled, and that it is not yet conclusive that man-made CO2 is a primary contributor to global warming?
Yeah, that science is unsettled, and I think the clearest example of that is in the 3 figures I put in the written testimony that show what the real world is doing, what climate models say it is doing, or should be doing, and the 2 don't agree.
Okay. Dr. Lashoff, we obviously are very pleased that you're here. We do want to have a balanced hearing. Unfortunately, there's only one of you, and you're outnumbered, but we do appreciate you being here. When you talked about the performance-based standard, Chairman Whitfield pointed this out, but I think it bears repeating. We could do a performance-based standard based on wind power or nuclear power. It would be 0, and those are the only 2 that could comply with it. On the other hand, we could do a performance-based standard set on the 1971 standards that were first put out under the 1970 Clean Air Act, and all the conventional power sources could comply with that. So it's a little misleading to say we're just asking for a performance-based standard when and everybody else at this table knows that the only ones that comply with the proposed EPA standard are natural gas, nuclear, and wind power. No coal plant can comply.
Well, Mr. Barton, the EPA's authority is to regulate emissions from fossil
But you
fuels.
admit what I said is true.
No, I don't, because we actually believe EPA could set a tighter standard than it has.
So you're saying that you think there's an existing coal technology that's economic that can comply with this standard?
As Mr. Thompson testified, there's 2 plants that are under construction that would meet this standard.
Yeah. What's the subsidy to the clean coal plant down in Texas? How many, I'd almost say billions of dollars, and I support that plant. But on its own merit, it can't compete without the tax subsidies and the direct subsidies to it. Isn't that a fact?
That may be true, but
that's not maybe true. It is true.
Well, I think
it is true.
I think there are plants potentially that have an enhanced oil recovery opportunity that may be competitive.
Now,
but let me just.
I want to ask Mr. Voiles a question. What is the most economic clean coal technology that's currently available today for commercialization, and how much does it add to the cost of the best coal technology that we already have in place? Power plant generation technology.
In our case, the best technology is the recent unit that we just put in service in 2011. It's a supercritical coal-fired unit that's got all of the available technology. It actually received an investment tax credit for clean coal technology, and it's been operating now for 2 years, and it actually produces 20 to 30% less CO2 than other technologies.
And how much additional does it cost than the technology that it's replacing?
Because of its efficiency, it runs all in the $30 to $40 a megawatt range. It's a little bit more expensive because of the amount of controls that are on it, but significantly less than what you would experience if you put carbon capture and sequestration.
Well, the number that I've been given is about, at a minimum, 30%.
Chairman, we got to have regular order.
You are exactly right, Mr. Rush.
I thought you was going to stop at some point, but
you couldn't be more right.
Thank
so as soon as I agree with you that you're right, I'm going to recognize Mr. Doyle.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Doyle's recognized. Is it Mr. Green instead of Mr. Doyle?
Whatever.
Is it Mr. Green? I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
I'm finally getting the rules down. If I come when the gavel goes down, when I come back, they'll let me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a district in Texas. We have refineries and chemical plants, and I know the EPA, when they exempted coal, they grandfathered in the existing coal facilities. And yet the tenor of this hearing and what we hear so much is that all these layoffs, whether it be Alpha or a lot of them, are based on the Obama administration and EPA. There's not a coal plant that's in existence that will have to deal with carbon under the EPA. And yet Canada is requiring their coal plants to retrofit. I hope that when the EPA gets around to my 5 refineries and chemical plants in our district, that they would let us have the same grandfather clause. But that's the concern I have. And I have an area that produces pet coke, not anything near what coal does. But we have not been able to use that pet coke in our own country because of the pollution problems in burning it. And we export it. And I support exporting coal. In fact, I know there's controversy over a port up in Washington. So, is the export market, could that keep our coal mines open, whether it be in West Virginia or Pennsylvania or western United States? Anyone from the coal industry?
Congressman Green, the United States consumes approximately 1 billion tons of coal annually. And the predominant customer for that coal is the electric utility industry, thus the cause of concern that we've expressed here today. There is a very robust international market in both steam coal and metallurgical coal, with low-cost producers from countries such as Australia being able to, in effect, outcompete the United States. Now, our exports have increased a good deal over the course of the last 5 years, but at most we're talking about an export market that is on the order of 60 to 70, 80 million tons a year against that 1 billion ton utility demand. So,
well, I guess I'm trying to understand that if it's 1 billion tons that's used in existing coal facilities now, and not one of them is being threatened to shut down because of carbon capture, it seems like we would continue. Now, I know there's a lot of things enter into it, including the cheap price of natural gas. I'm a big supporter of nuclear power. The problem is, if we didn't have loan guarantees, and even questionable then, we wouldn't have a nuclear power plant because of the low price of natural gas. So I think it's a lot of market conditions, and coming from where I'm in my accent, I can't not support natural gas expansion. But Mr. Thompson, you mentioned that several states already set emission standards for implementation for carbon capture for new coal-fired plants. Can you elaborate on how do companies plan to comply with these standards?
There are several states that already have emission limits that are kind of similar to what U.S. EPA has proposed. Some of them are like California and Washington State. There is a proposed coal project in California called HECA that would seeks to meet that standard and do so with using carbon capture and storage. In places such as my state, Illinois, there's actually a clean coal portfolio standard that seeks to promote coal projects with 50% capture. And some of those have not, I think, are unlikely to move forward in Illinois simply because the price of gas is so low. Yeah. And that's a real challenge. But what I think is really important to understand is that what projects need is certainty. And the regulations that EPA has proposed are quite reasonable, 30 years to comply if you want to choose that route in some cases for new plants. The challenge with H.R. 6172 is that it introduces confusion about whether or not EPA would be allowed to issue those very reasonable standards. And in an era of low natural gas prices, that uncertainty actually, I would submit, favors the expansion of gas, because someone who wants to finance a project or is being asked to finance a project is going to say, well, I'm not really sure if there's some group.
I'm almost out of time. I understand that if somebody's cost benefiting it out today and you're building a new power plant, natural gas will get there. Wind, solar, nothing will get there without substantial tax incentives except for natural gas. I'm a big supporter of enhanced oil recovery and we're trying to grow that in Texas because we have a lot of fields we can do. And do you have any suggestions on how we can further incentivize enhanced oil recovery? Use some of that carbon from other states. And I know there's a potential pipeline from Mississippi into southeast Texas where our refineries are to be able to deal with that.
A group of environmentalist coal companies, chemical companies, gotten together under the umbrella of the National EOR Initiative and recommended several recommendations. I'll highlight one. And that's to actually, to use a portion of the tax revenue that comes from new oil development and put that back into subsidizing some of the cost of CCS capture. That would allow a lot of projects to move ahead. So I would direct this committee to look at the National EOR Initiative's recommendations. I think that's a great starting point.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you gave...
Well, I just want the record to show that I gave you extra time, but it was only because you're from Texas. Yeah, if you'd have been from Illinois or Pennsylvania, I'd have been on you. Well, maybe Mike can have a Texas draw. Yeah. We want to recognize the gentleman from the Cornhusker State, Mr. Terry.
Since I'm from the Cornhusker State, do I get 1 minute?
Depends on how you're behaving.
Thank you. Mr. Hilton and Mr. Thompson, I want to ask you kind of, as I'm trying to sort through this, I haven't been able to resolve one specific question, and that's whether or not technology exists to meet the proposed standards. And Mr. Hilton suggests that it's a work in progress. Mr. Thompson, you're saying they're already building them. So could Mr. Hilton, you start first. how do I resolve this as a Cornhusker?
Well, the first part is it said it's technologically feasible. As far as the getting to the point where it's commercially available, we need the proof that the technology, that what we're going to guarantee and what we're going to do. And there are no plants currently operating out there right now at commercial scale. Kemper will reach commercial scale because it's been able to get the financing. And this is what I've said that CCS needs. It has a 20% rate increase. Summit, if it goes ahead, because it doesn't have financing yet, it has an MOU with Sinopec to sell part of the project and get Chinese financing. It may go ahead. And this is the point that I was making. There are no projects out there that are going ahead on their own with a financing package that is there. And that's what we need as suppliers to be able to sell and guarantee the performance. Southern also has the unique thing. It's their technology, and they are a self, if you will, guarantor.
Mr. Thompson, how?
Sure. Thanks. I also agree with Bob about that the technology is technically feasible. Here's the difference I think that maybe you're alluding to. Kemper and the Texas Clean Energy Project use pre-combustion capture technology. That's been around for 30 years, commercially available. If you look at my written statements, you'll see what Mississippi Power said in support of that. What Bob is talking about is the post-combustion capture. And his technology from his company, I respect his opinion that it's not ready yet, but there are projects in Texas like the Trailblazer project. It's a proposed project, would be post-combustion capture, but it's not moving ahead, fully permitted, that would use this post-combustion capture technology. And they have been able to get warranties from either MHI or Fluor, I can't remember which, to do post-combustion.
Okay, let me interrupt one question, because you said something in a previous answer that stood out to me from Nebraska versus Texas is we don't have oil fields. And you said having that available is a key component to its fiscal viability. So what about our northern coal-fired plants?
Pipelines. We've been supporters.
Oh, we've tried that. They're against it. Sorry.
Well, not everyone is. 700 miles of pipelines have been proposed by Denbury to go from the Gulf Coast area through to Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois. And legislation has been passed in those three states to provide eminent domain authority to make that happen. So it's not easy, but that's my short answer.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. And then back to you, Mr. Hilton. You had mentioned the issue of there's liability issues. Can you, in a minute and in 15 seconds, tell me what the liability issues are specifically and what other barriers in addition to liability?
Okay, the core of the liability issue is obviously if you sequester, there's going to be need, typically in accounting, to have some liability associated with having put that CO2 in a reservoir. So we expect that that's going to have to be dealt with just like any other waste that's happened. May even end up that way in EOR before it's over, before things are done. So, I mean, there's the liability issue. There's the issue of poor ownership. Who owns the poor structure you're putting the CO2 in? And particularly in the eastern United States, it's the classic, you own to the center of the earth under your house. And so, if you add in paying royalties to put CO2 under people's house, if they will let you, you got to get permission. This is a major issue. So I think those are the really two biggest issues that we're facing.
All right.
I would just say that with EOR, which could account for a third of the nation's coal fleet, there are no liability issues. I mean, we've injected over 1 billion tons of CO2 in Texas since 1980s. So there are ways of addressing this issue even within the EOR context.
Gentleman's time has expired. We now recognize the gentleman from the Keystone State.
I can't promise that, Mr.
The winner of the congressional baseball game manager, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for all your testimony. I've read it. Mr. Triscoe, you mentioned in your testimony a 2008 wires charge bill, which I was a co-sponsor of, by the way, which would have provided a path forward for CCS funding. Can you tell us a little bit about where that bill ended up?
Congressman Doyle, the bill eventually ended up as Section 113 of the Waxman-Markey bill, the larger climate change bill. And while that bill passed the House, the companion legislation in the Senate did not fare as well.
Thank you. Mr. Hilton, in your testimony, you refer to several commercial-scale CCS demonstrations planned in other countries, the UK, European Union, even China. Can you tell us how these projects are being funded?
Well, the UK projects are being funded by a billion-pound fund the UK government's putting up. Most of the European projects are a combination of EU funding from what's called the NER 300, which is a grant for allowances which can be sold and then funded, which is somewhere in the order of 2.5 to 4 billion euros worth of funding. The Chinese projects are a little bit, I'm going to say, different. Chinese projects get funded because the Chinese government particularly says that project will go ahead, and where the funding actually comes from is harder for, I'll say, an outsider.
From the Chinese government.
Right.
What about the CCS projects here in the United States, like the Summit plant? How's that being financed?
Well, the Summit plant has a significant grant from the government. It's going to do EOR, but its financing, it looks like it will come from now selling part of the project. There's an MOU with Sinopec and Chinese banks.
Right. So would you say there's an argument here then for a commitment to federal funding for CCS demonstration projects like we provided in the stimulus bill? In other words, we need to step up to the plate, don't we?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So this question's for several of the panelists. There's been a lot of testimony this morning about the state of CCS technology development and the need for better drivers of CCS technology. Many of you have addressed this in your testimony already, but I want to ask you what you think would be the best driver for commercialization of affordable CCS technology. Would it be EPA regulation? Would it be a carbon tax, cap and trade, or something else? Just very quickly, because I have some more to say. Go ahead. Or pick your own response.
Congressman Doyle, we would again advocate consideration of the wires charge approach. That is a non-budget way to raise $10 billion to support CCS demonstrations. Until we have commercial scale demonstrations, there will not be a regulatory structure that will allow that technology to proceed. And given the state of the federal budget, which we're all acutely aware, we need to find a non-budget source of these revenues.
Thank you.
Yes, I'd first of all refer you to the Kirk-Epry roadmap that recognizes a technology roadmap to get to cost-effective, reliable CCS capture. We would also support the funding that Mr. Trisco just
Great. I don't mean to rush you, but I got some more to say. Go ahead, Mr. Voiles.
I would only add to what Mr. McCulloch says by saying, and we've talked about the Kemper County plant, that plant has been progressing without the imposition of any standard. So the industry is investing in carbon research, trying to develop technology, and that should continue.
Mr. Hilton.
Clearly, I think a wires charge is a similar thing.
Combination, both performance standards and incentives that promote enhanced oil recovery.
Yeah, I'd say we need the standards to make it clear that if you're going to build fossil plants, you're going to need CCS in the future to motivate people to invest, and then we need support.
Dr. Christie.
Yes, I just say please don't raise the rates of Alabamians for utilities. Because
okay.
Already
Thank you. This week, Mr. Chairman, in the House, our friends on the other side of the aisle are going to bring a bill to stop the war on coal to the House floor. And among other things, the bill prohibits any acknowledgement that global warming is caused by carbon emissions, and it bars the federal government from setting any kind of carbon emission limit. The bill we're debating here in the subcommittee today also would bar the federal government from setting any kind of limit on carbon pollution. In 2009, Democrats passed a stimulus bill that provided $3.4 billion to CCS funding. That was 49% of all the energy funding in the stimulus bill went to CCS. Half of all that funding, CCS. That bill was denigrated, maligned, and smeared by many in this House chamber. Also in 2009, we took up a cap and trade bill that had $60 billion for CCS funding, as well as the $10 billion in wire charges that Mr. Triscoe referred to in his testimony. That bill as well was smeared, denigrated, and maligned by many on this House floor. So here we are today dealing with regulations that are a result of court-imposed deadlines, and we're being told that the industry doesn't have commercially available tools to meet these limits. Well, whose fault is that? I would just say to my friends, when you want to bring a bill forward to invest, you got to do both. You can't just
Gentleman's time has expired.
Well, I'd like just 10 more seconds.
I'm not from Texas.
Many people. Let me just say this to my friends. I have sympathy for what's going on in the coal industry. Bring a bill to the floor that says we need commercial available technology before we can do certain regulations, but where's the money to go with it? There's no commitment to fund the technology. We do this in nuclear and we do this in other areas. Show me the money. We had $60 billion on the table and that got voted down. Don't just come here and say you can't do something because the technology is not available.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do feel obligated to point out that during the first 2 years of the Obama administration, when cap and trade, Waxman-Markey passed and the stimulus bill did pass, of course, the President's party controlled all the levers of government. Whatever this side of the dais wanted was absolutely irrelevant because the Democrats had a 50-vote majority in the House and a 60-vote filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. It was the Senate that was unable to do Waxman-Markey because after they saw the public angst over Waxman-Markey being shoved through the floor of the House the last day of June of 2009, no senator had the courage to step forward and say, let's talk about this. They wanted to withdraw from that fight. Whether it was right or wrong, that's what happened. Blame us if you want, if you can't find any other reason. But the reality was 60 Democratic votes in the Senate, and the President could not get that bill even considered in the other body. So don't blame House Republicans. I didn't want that. I thought it was a bad idea. I thought it was a bad idea on several levels. I'll still vote against it if you're able to bring it up again. But don't blame House Republicans for your inability to get that done, because you know very well that thing was forced through this committee, subcommittee, full committee, and the floor of the House, and it was in fact to the detriment of your side because honestly you never recovered the public confidence after you did that. It was done in the worst possible way, and I would hope whatever happens with energy legislation going forward, it is constructed in a bipartisan fashion. I think that's the lesson a lot of us can take away from the last 3.5 years. Mr. Hilton, I have a question for you because when Michael Williams was chairman of the Texas Railroad Commission, I think he came to this committee and testified either in committee or in a briefing, and he talked about how the state of Texas had taken title. You were answering some questions from Mr. Terry about the liability issues. The state of Texas, as I understand it, took title to the carbon that was pumped back down for carbon sequestration. Is that not correct?
Yeah, that is correct.
Does that help with the liability issue?
It helps in Texas.
Right. Has any other state stepped forward and done that?
I don't believe so.
Now, Texas, of course, is a little bit different because we were our own country. We don't have federal lands. We have state lands. So there actually is the availability of some state land to do that. In other areas of the country where there are large amounts of federal lands, has there been any discussion about the federal government taking title to the carbon that might be injected under federal lands?
I can say it's been suggested. I don't know if the federal government itself has discussed it, but people have talked about it, of course.
But even there, with the liability cloud removed, as it was in Texas, it's still been. It's been a slow go. It has not. It's not something that's really been. There hasn't been a lot of enthusiasm for it. Dr. Christie, welcome back to our committee. You spent a lot of time here over the years. I really appreciate the graphic representation that you brought to us today. Fascinating because. I lived through at least half of it, so I actually remember those years very well. There does seem to be a certain amount of randomness to the temperature variations that you described. There also seems to be some clustering. Are you able to make any predictions about, is this occurring on a cyclic basis? Clearly some of the most startling temperatures were in the early part of the last century, as opposed to these latter years when the carbon numbers were supposedly going up. Are you able to make any predictive statements based upon the data that you've collected?
You know, my most confident predictive statement is that if it happened before, it'll happen again and probably worse.
Well, okay, history always repeats itself right up until the time that it doesn't.
Yes. In fact, even on the Arctic sea ice thing, I think it would be interesting to note that over Western civilization, the Arctic has probably been warmer than it is today.
Well, let me ask you a question, because it did come up that because of the reliance on natural gas, when the price collapsed to natural gas in 2008, apparently carbon dioxide levels are lower now than what they were predicted to be. Is that correct?
In this country, they have fallen, yes.
Is that something that's happened worldwide, or it is just this country?
I believe that's not the case worldwide. It's still going up, thanks to China and India, who are really burning a lot of coal and stuff.
So if we're really able to achieve the goals that were set forward in Waxman-Markey, the rest of the world could actually negate that, any benefit effect, if indeed that was the cause of global warming.
Whatever the United States does, it will be pretty much imperceptible for the global climate.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Burgess. Thank you, and Mr. Olson.
I'll yield you additional time.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I was maybe getting even for Mr. Doyle right there. Mr. Olson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, and on behalf of the people of Texas 22, welcome to our witnesses. Thank you for your time and expertise today. Clean air and economic growth are not mutually exclusive. The great people of Texas 22 aren't buying the notion that EPA can create jobs by strangling business with overly burdensome and unnecessary regulations, especially when their electricity bills are going up. We all know the people of my district, Texas 22, were outraged by the comments our president made when he was running for the office in 2008 in San Francisco. You guys know these comments, but just let me read them for you. If someone wants to build a new coal-fired power plant, they can. But it will bankrupt them because they will be charged a huge sum. I served 10 years in the United States Navy. Sounds like an attack on coal, doesn't it? My first question for you, Mr. McCullough, Mr. Hilton, and Mr. Voiles. Do you believe EPA's goal with all these new rules is to shut down coal plants, like the president said in San Francisco, and keep new ones from being built?
Well, the motive is up to someone else to decide, but the effect is that no new coal plants will be built.
Mr. Voiles?
I would concur with that.
Mr. Hilton?
I would concur with that.
Thank you. Texas is predicted to have a severe supply shortage, meaning that we'll need more energy than it can generate. We're the second largest state, the fastest growing state in our nation. We're expected to have a 2,500 megawatt shortfall in generating capacity, equivalent to 5 large power plants as early as 2014. We've proposed a petcoke plant in Texas, Corpus Christi area, the Las Brisas Energy Center, that EPA has been slow walking for more than 3 years. Some of my colleagues and I have wrote EPA about 2 months ago, and they haven't gotten back to us yet. That's not the record. I sent them a letter about NASA my first term. That's over 3 years ago. So we're optimistic that we'll get something from EPA. But is this the sort of treatment you guys are getting used to from EPA? Stonewall? No answers, no responses? Put another way, has EPA been a corporate partner, or are they an adversary working against you?
Well, we've certainly had our discussions with US EPA around many rules, the MAC rule for mercury being included in that discussion, and saw very little in the way of response positively for our industry.
Mr. Voiles?
We too have had numbers of discussions with EPA on numbers of rules, and the plant that I spoke of earlier, we had some discussions with them about the time it was taken to get our permits, but we did finally achieve those.
Mr. Hilton?
As a technology supplier, we really don't get into those kind of discussions per se. We talk about technology with the agency.
Okay, one round of questions for all of you, starting out with Dr. Christie. Our former EPA regional administrator, Mr. Al Armendariz, was in charge of overseeing our power plants. He had resigned when his radical agenda came forward to actually crucify, he used that term, to crucify oil and gas companies went public. He now works for the Sierra Club, their Beyond Coal campaign. What do you think about that? Are there more people like Dr. Armendariz working at EPA now?
My impression in the federal government, there are several folks like that have a pretty clear view of what they think the climate situation is.
Mr. Triscoe?
Our experience, Congressman, is that EPA is staffed by highly experienced experts in environmental regulation. And if one follows the letter of the Clean Air Act that has not been amended by Congress for some 22 years, except by virtue of a 2007 5-4 Supreme Court ruling, it's not difficult to understand how we've ended up in the predicament we are today.
Mr. McCullough?
Yes, I'd agree. In the discussions, the Clean Air Act is, I would classify as used as a reason or a crutch to not be flexible, and it's pretty consistent in that way.
A weapon to drive an agenda as opposed to making clean air and clean water be in the agenda. Sounds like that's what you're saying. Mr. Boyles, your comment, sir?
I don't know that I would add anything that hasn't already been said. I'm not sure where they get all the employees, but they have some expertise that we talk to from time to time, and I think that they do try to use the Clean Air Act to the advantage of one side or the other, depending upon the issue.
Mr. Hilton?
I've got great respect for the professionals at EPA, and they do have some terrific experts there. And I think the comments that Mr. Triscoe made are probably very substantial.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
My experience is the EPA officials are very professional, and some leave the agency to work for industry and some for environmental groups.
And finally, last but certainly not least, Dr. Lashoff.
Yeah, my experience is similar. EPA is trying to protect public health by setting standards. They've proposed a fuel-neutral and technology-neutral standard, and the public supports it overwhelmingly.
Thank you. I'm way over time. I thank the chair.
The gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Thompson, I want to focus back in on the enhanced oil recovery. You aware that earlier this year there was an amendment on the floor that was adopted by Congressman Conley that cut the research funding in the enhanced oil recovery?
I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, so when we hear the folks on the other side talking about this, if we know this is going to be part of the solution, this is where we need to be focusing on, but yet all these members, and Mr. Doyle is one of them, that voted to cut the funding. I find that very interesting. But let me build on that just a little bit. In fact, all the Democrats did. If the oil industry, because I'm somewhat aware of this process, so if the oil industry finds this as a possibility of an increased recovery, instead of, well, how many of them are contributing from the oil industry? How many of them are contributing to the carbon capture research so that would enable that to occur, to provide them with a supply of material? Are any oil companies contributing to the CCS research?
Sure, Shell, among others, is.
Do you have numbers for that? How much are they contributing? $1 million, or are they contributing hundreds of millions of dollars?
No, I don't. But what I'd be happy to do is after the hearing.
I'd like to understand more about where
I'd be happy to
because if they're
respond
going to be
in
the
writing.
ones who are going to benefit from this, I think they are the ones who should be contributing the money for it. Let's go back now to Dr. Lashoff. I'm just curious. It was touched on just a minute ago about the CO2 emissions. Are you aware that the CO2 emissions across North America are down down to a low that hasn't been seen in 20 years?
Yes, I am. I published a report on that a month or so ago.
And so with that, you think we ought to go we need to continue this message, this fight?
Well, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is 25% higher than it was in the year I was born, with 1959. And what we need to do is stabilize that level. The U.S. needs to reduce further. Certainly China and India also need to reduce. The U.S. has to provide leadership.
Because what you're saying is it's the main culprit. I think I heard you say that's the main culprit of global warming.
Carbon dioxide traps heat in the atmosphere. It would be remarkable if it weren't causing global warming, and in fact, we're seeing global warming.
So you disagree with Dr. Lewis, Hal Lewis, when he resigned from his position with the American Physicists Society, when he said this is the greatest pseudoscience fraud perpetrated on America?
Yeah, I totally disagree with that.
I would assume you do. But I think several others have joined him in resigning with it, but because there are other scientists that disagree with you on that this is being used for other purposes. So I look at what Hal Lewis has said, and if you look back at the Milankovitch, the Serbian physicist back in the last century, that by virtue of his own studies, has predicted that this is what was going to happen at this time in our history. Are you aware of that?
I am. Look, scientists will always disagree with each other. That's what they do. That's how they make a living, is writing papers to disagree with other scientists. If we predicated policy on unanimity among scientists on any issue, we would never do anything.
Do you recognize, too, that National Geographic just came out with a study that says we're just coming out of an ice age, a mini ice age, and therefore we should be expecting higher temperatures today?
I haven't seen that particular National Geographic article, but the fact is that the amount of heat trapping, that the excess CO2 that we put into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels is now a much bigger factor in influencing the Earth's climate than the Milankovitch cycles and what we've had historically. We've entered a new era that many scientists call the...
So my point here is, given that there's not unanimity, and I remember earlier last year when Lisa Jackson came before us, she said, it's all been decided. That global warming is anthropogenic. Global warming is man-made cause, and it's CO2 driven. That there is no argument anymore. But you also just acknowledge that that's not. That the science is still up in the air over that issue. So I accept that there is not a lack of unanimity on it, because what we're about to do here is allow the EPA to impose a regulation. That's the purpose of my bill. Was just hold back. If we had the scientific ways of doing it, then to go ahead and implement it. But when we don't have the technology available, let's hold back, because there's enough evidence that possibly CO2 is not contributing to as much of the problem as you're suggesting that it is. Wow. So let's just hold back. I'm over my time.
Mr. McKinley, if I can just answer quickly. I don't agree that the science is up in the air. I said that there's not unanimity among scientists, and there won't be. But the National Academy of Science said that the idea that carbon dioxide is contributing to climate change is as well proven as gravity, and I think that's a strong basis for making policy.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
Could you recognize someone from the minority and then come back to me? Is that possible, Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman yields back. Will you wait? Okay.
Yeah. Yields back. Okay, well.
He needs to be recognized. Mr. Chairman.
Will the gentleman yield for 30 seconds?
No, well, I'm ready to go.
Go ahead.
If the majority does not have a need to have the time. So here's what I would say. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Here's what I would say, that coal has dropped from 51% of electrical generation down to 35% over the last 5 years. But there's a concomitant trend as well, which is in operating simultaneously, which is that natural gas has risen from 21% to 30%. So there's a war between fossil fuels going on in our country right now. By the way, the same thing is happening on home heating oil in New England. The market for home heating oil is collapsing as the price of natural gas is rising. Now, why is that? Because natural gas is so much less expensive than home heating oil. The price of natural gas has collapsed in terms of source for generation for electricity. And by the way, the same thing is true for wind. Wind was only 1% of all electricity just 4 years ago. It is now 4% of all electricity.
So coal is losing a marketplace battle. There is no question about it. It's losing a marketplace battle. Natural gas is up to 30%. It'll probably go up a percent a year every year. That's just a fossil fuel battle. Same thing is true for home heating oil. Natural gas is eating into home heating oil in a very significant way. That's a fossil fuel into fuel battle. And I know a lot of people don't like it. You know, any more than, let's be honest, any more than the horse industry liked the horseless carriage industry. Okay, just kept moving on. You know, but when the price drops, that's what you get. So, you know, a lot of people are just trying to blame the concern which the Obama administration or members of this committee that might care about clean air or pollution or science. But that's not what's really been happening. This is all happening before there is any rule promulgated on CO2. Right? This is already happening, and it's going to continue to happen because of the low price of natural gas. Now, again, the Democrats are the party of natural gas, and the Republicans are the party of coal. You know, if that's how you want to frame it. But that, of course, would be a wrong frame. Okay? That's the wrong frame. I'm just bringing to you the marketplace reality, the economics of it, right? When a TV set costs, a flat-screen TV costs $5,000, you don't buy it. When the cost collapsed down to $2.99, you're buying one. That's what's happening with natural gas. People are buying natural gas, utilities and homeowners, and they're moving to it. Plain and simple. All right? So, Dr. Christie, I want to read to you two statements. One, scientific evidence strongly indicates that natural influences cannot explain the rapid increase in global near-surface temperatures observed during the second half of the 20th century. And two, it is virtually certain that increasing atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases will cause global surface climate to be warmer. Dr. Christie, do you agree with those statements?
Those statements have no magnitude to them, no metrics to them. So if the increase is 1/1000th of a degree due to greenhouse effect, you would say yes. You would agree with those statements.
Okay. Well, Dr. Christie, those statements are direct quotes from the 2003 American Geophysical Union Statement on human impacts on climate that you helped to draft. So, Dr. Christie, in 2003, you agreed with those statements, but the Dr. Christie of 2012 does not agree with those statements. Dr. Lashoff, do you agree with those statements? Is the science, Dr. Lashoff, more certain now than in 2000 than it was in 2003?
Yes, there's been a huge accumulation of observations and studies which tie the warming that we've seen to the accumulation of heat-trapping pollution in the atmosphere. Of course, as Dr. Christie says, there's natural variability. There will always be natural variability. But on top of that natural variability, there is a undeniable trend that's very significant and very dangerous.
So, Dr. Lashoff, tell us the status of the Arctic ice right now, could you?
Right. So NASA released data yesterday showing that the Arctic ice has fallen to about 3.4 million square kilometers. Its minimum. It's less than 50% of what it was in 1979. It's about a 49% reduction from the average over the whole period from 79 to...
Thank you, Doctor. I yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. You know, I would just say in conclusion to my friends, and many weren't here when we passed the cap and trade bill in the House, but I think one thing's clear. Mr. Hilton says, you know, he has an MOU with the Chinese. We're going to use coal for the foreseeable future, and even if we don't use it, China's going to use it, India's going to use it, other countries are going to use it. It only makes sense that if it's going to be used, we try to do it in the most efficient and environmentally safe way. To do that, we have to make an investment in it. These things are not going to happen by themselves. So either the Chinese are going to develop the technology, they're going to come over here and fund the project, and part of that deal is they get the technology, and then they get to market it to the world, or the United States does it. I would suggest that, you know, if we want to deal with coal, I would say to my friends on the other side of the aisle, let's put our money where our mouth is. And if you're going to pass a bill saying that there's no commercially available technology, then where's the money to make that happen? And until we do that, other countries will do that, and they'll have the technology and we won't.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr.
Christie, did you want to respond to anything that the previous gentleman said? I know that he made some assertions about your positions and that you didn't get a chance to respond. Would you like to do that at this time?
I agree with those statements in 2003. I was one of the authors. There were no magnitudes on those statements. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It will cause surface warming. How much is the uncertainty?
And I would point out that one of the things that I see as a difference with what's happening now, and lots of times people like to talk about the market conditions, and clearly the market conditions are important. But one of the things that's interesting is that there was a reference to the horseless carriage versus the horse-drawn vehicles, but we didn't outlaw horses at the same time as the horseless carriage was being developed, and that's the big difference. And while I am getting older every day and thankful for that, I can remember in my youth a gentleman who in my hometown still had his team of horses to plow fields, and people felt he did a great job, and he made a living doing that for a number of years, well into the 1970s, and horses were not made illegal by the advent of the automobile. Mr. Hilton, did I hear you say that there, and I may have misunderstood, so please get me straight, that in regard to the Kemper coal-fired power plant with what they're doing, that there would be a 20% rate increase?
That's what I've read, yes.
You know, this is part of what causes me great concern, and Dr. Christie, you touched on this earlier as well, is that we have all of these requirements, and it's not just the one that we're debating today, but we have numerous requirements coming in, and every time we turn around, there's a rate increase. We're already experiencing that in my district, which is a coal-producing district in southwest Virginia. But the folks, many counties away from where the coal is actually dug are watching their electric rates go up, and it's making it hard on the working poor and on the poor folks because they can't afford a 10% increase, or in this case, a 20% increase. And you mentioned that they were having similar problems in your community in Alabama. Is that true, or that you've noticed this?
I would just say this, that we have many, many poor people in my state, and any increase in cost of living for them is really hardship for them.
And that's true in my district as well, and I think that's probably true in a lot of the districts across the United States, that what you have is when the price goes up, then it makes it hard. And what's interesting is that everybody likes to talk about the statement by the president when he said that they would bankrupt the facilities if they were using coal or whatever. But they also mentioned at that time in 2008, he mentioned as well, because I'm capping greenhouse gases, coal power plants, natural gas, you name it, whatever the plants were, whatever the industry was, they would have to retrofit their operations. That will cost money. They will pass that money on to consumers. So I just find it rather interesting that the consumer side of this equation is often left out. And Dr. Christie, you indicated that if the United States took all these actions and we reduced and continued to reduce our carbon footprint, that it would be relatively, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, I don't remember, something along the lines of negligible. Is that correct?
Yes.
In the world's output. But wouldn't you agree with me that it's not negligible to the families that are having to pay those higher increased prices for electricity to light and heat their homes or to run factories?
Yes, I think anyone who sees their utility bill rise would feel the effect, and it wouldn't be good for them.
And of course, we've got not just this regulation, but lots of other regulations that are putting pressure on those prices. And then, of course, you have all these folks that are out of work, because it's not just the 1,200 folks that are going to be laid off by Alpha Natural Resources, which, by the way, is headquartered in my district. But it's also all the other coal mines that have laid off people, sometimes 20 at a time, 30 at a time, that people aren't necessarily noticing. And then the people who are laid off from suppliers, Joy Manufacturing, other suppliers to the coal mines, the railroads that may not have had the effect yet but will have the effect, et cetera. And so you're going to have more and more people who are unemployed, because we are insisting upon, for a negligible result, we are insisting upon taking our economy and throwing it in the trash can for a negligible result on carbon footprint in the world, and we're sending our jobs overseas to other countries, and we're watching as they gain the wealth. And when there comes a time when there is a technology that may make things better, we won't have the money to buy that technology because we will have sent all of our wealth overseas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Chairman recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Thank you to the panelists for the opportunity to be here today and your testimony. Several years ago, when Congress was considering its first greenhouse gas bill, I received a letter from a couple of local rural electric associations that were talking about the price impact that that particular regulation would have on their customers. In fact, according to one analysis in northeastern Colorado, they determined that a average farmer, the average sprinkler cost for a farmer, would increase by about $2,000 per sprinkler. This is a big pivot irrigation system, 160 acres. Now, if you're a farmer in eastern Colorado, you don't just have one pivot irrigation system. You've got 5, maybe 10. That's $2,000 each. Maybe you have more. And so we're talking about considerable costs being added under their estimate from the Rural Electric Association that particular regulation would have on their customers' operations. And so, Mr. McAuliffe, or was it Mr. Hilton that you mentioned rates increase of 20%, is that correct? In Mississippi? And I'd be curious to see if, Mr. Triscoe, are you hearing anything through the various businesses that you work with on rate increases?
Chairman, we understand that the Kentucky Public Service Commission has decided a number of cases. Now, this is for prospective Clean Air Act regulations for hazardous air pollutants and the like, not this proposed regulation. And the rate increases are on the order of 16 to 18%.
16 to 18%. Mr. McAuliffe?
Yes, I would agree with that. We recently pulled down an order for a new scrubber for a plant in Kentucky that would have impacted the customers there by over 30%.
Mr. Voiles?
Yes, as I said in my testimony, the compliance plans that we recently got approved for the utility MAC rule and the new source or the National Ambient Air Quality Standards are impacting our ratepayers by up to 14 and 18%, not counting anything on carbon.
And to follow up on Mr. Griffith's questions as well, these are costs that are passed on to your customers, your consumers. Is that correct, Mr. Hilton? Understand. Right. Mr. Voiles?
As well as we've said before, we not only pass it along to all of our ratepayers, but it passes along to the commercial industry, so the food prices are impacted, McDonald's prices are impacted, everybody's prices are impacted.
And who does that affect the most disproportionately in our society? People on a fixed income, poor?
It certainly presents some significant challenges for fixed income.
Mr. McAuliffe, what happens to American business competitiveness with rate increases of 20%, 18%, 14%?
Obviously, it further disadvantages them. We've seen that in our territory with especially aluminum smelters who, the Century Aluminum plant in West Virginia went out of business with the recession, and recently Ormat in our home state of Ohio has just announced that they're going to decrease their production.
Dr. Lashoff, what happens to an economy where rates are increasing by 20%, the poor are being hurt, and those on fixed income are being hurt disproportionately?
Well, Mr. Chairman, if we could return to the specific proposal that EPA has put forward, it
would
not cause any rate increases. But I want to just provide the context.
My question is to you, if rates increase by 20%, for a variety of reasons that have been mentioned, what happens to our economy? What happens to the poor? What happens to people on a fixed income?
Depends what else is happening in the economy. If people are using energy more efficiently, their costs might go down, which we've seen in many, many states that have invested in energy efficiency.
So
you can't just look at rates. So you have to actually look at costs.
If people who have low income are able to buy something that's more energy efficient, that will help them.
Yes, and if we provide, and technology is improving on the efficiency side.
Okay, so if people on a fixed income or poor can afford to buy something new, then that will help them.
Well, and as pollution also imposes more severe costs on poorer people, they're exposed to it more. So the benefits of air pollution regulations, in fact, go to the low-income people. So EPA is actually required to look at costs and benefits when they propose regulations.
We've actually heard testimony in this committee before where they have failed to do an adequate analysis on cost and benefits. And this is, I think, one of the frustrating parts of this entire debate. Nobody doubts that we can do a better job when it comes to energy efficiency. There's no doubt about that. Nobody doubts that we have incredible opportunities in new energy. But the problem is when we have regulations that come down from agencies that increase costs on developing energy, on consuming energy, it hurts our economy and it hurts the people who are most vulnerable in our society. And that seems to get left out of this entire debate, is the people who are affected disproportionately are poor and low income because it hurts the economy and it hurts their ability to lift themselves and their families out of the position that they're in. I see that my time has expired as well. And thank you very much to the panelists for being here, to the witnesses for your time and testimony today. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.